I confronted my sister for blatantly flirting with my boyfriend just days before her wedding, only to catch them in a passionate embrace behind my parents' house. When I told her fiancé the truth, he shocked everyone by exposing her at the altar in front of the entire family. I recently found myself in a complicated situation involving my sister, my partner, and an upcoming wedding. I discovered my sister was involved with my boyfriend just a week before her big day. I confided in her fiancé, but he seemed to brush off my concerns. However, he astonished everyone present at the ceremony. As a 28-year-old woman, I was navigating a challenging period concerning my 26-year-old sister and my 29-year-old boyfriend. With her wedding drawing near, I began to observe a distinct shift in her demeanor whenever my partner was around. Initially, it wasn't anything obvious, merely small, subtle acts that left me feeling uneasy. It started with seemingly innocent remarks. My sister would often exclaim how genuinely amusing my boyfriend was, even at jokes that weren't particularly clever. She'd laugh with an excessive enthusiasm at nearly everything he uttered. At first, I tried to dismiss these observations, attributing them to her heightened excitement for the approaching nuptials. However, as days turned into weeks, more disturbing patterns emerged. She started fabricating reasons to casually touch him, perhaps placing a hand on his arm during a conversation or lightly bumping into him as she passed by. These gestures, though understated, were unmistakable. I also noticed her gaze lingering on him for an extended period when he wasn't looking, which made my gut twist with unease. One evening, after we returned from a family dinner where my sister had been particularly flirtatious, I decided to address it with my boyfriend. I turned to him and inquired, "Did you notice Sarah's behavior tonight?" He looked at me with confusion, responding, "What exactly do you mean?" I then recounted the specific actions I had observed, the exaggerated laughter, the unwarranted touching, and the prolonged stares. He listened, but after a moment, he simply shrugged and remarked, "I think you might be overthinking it. She's probably just thrilled about the wedding. It's harmless." Despite his reassurances, I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that something was amiss. The situation certainly didn't feel harmless to me. So, I resolved to keep a closer watch, hoping that my anxieties were unfounded and that I was simply overreacting. Yet, the ensuing weeks were fraught with tension. Every time we were in my sister's presence, I found myself constantly monitoring her, scrutinizing every minute detail of her interactions. It became clear she consistently tried to position herself close to my boyfriend. She would frequently choose to sit beside him whenever possible and seemed to conjure endless excuses to request his assistance with wedding-related tasks, even when I was standing right there. One afternoon, we were all gathered at my parents' residence for a family barbecue. At one point, I stepped inside to use the restroom, and upon my return, I witnessed something that made my heart sink. My sister and my boyfriend were conversing softly in a secluded corner of the yard, standing unusually close. My sister was giggling at something he said, a sound that made my stomach churn with apprehension. The instant they became aware of my presence, they swiftly moved apart, and my sister walked away as if nothing significant had transpired. A wave of nausea and anger washed over me, but I opted not to confront them then, unwilling to create a scene at a family gathering. Instead, I waited until we arrived home that night. When we were finally alone, I attempted to broach the subject as calmly as possible. Asked my boyfriend what he and my sister had been discussing earlier. He appeared surprised by my query and explained they were simply talking about some wedding details, such as the music selection. His explanation did not satisfy me. I couldn't help but question why such a straightforward conversation necessitated them standing in such close proximity. He sighed, clearly exasperated, and again tried to dismiss my concerns. He assured me once more that nothing untoward was happening, insisting my sister was merely being friendly. But by this point, I could no longer suppress my emotions. I voiced my frustration, pointing out that my sister was practically throwing herself at him, and he wasn't doing anything to discourage it. My words seemed to wound him, and he looked at me with a pained expression, asking what exactly I expected him to do. He reminded me that she was my sibling, and he was simply trying to be courteous, Suggesting he tell her to back off seemed out of the question for him. I retorted that he could at least establish some boundaries, clarifying that he wasn't interested in anything beyond a platonic connection. Yet, he maintained that he held no interest in her whatsoever, asserting there was nothing to clarify because I was perceiving issues that didn't exist. Our dialogue went in circles, with neither of us willing to acknowledge the other's perspective, leaving us both exasperated and uncertain of our next move. After a protracted argument without any resolution, it became evident that our conversation was leading nowhere. My boyfriend continually insisted I was merely imagining things, and no matter how diligently I tried, I couldn't make him see what was so painfully apparent to me. Ultimately, we both retired for the night, feeling angry and frustrated, with the underlying issues still unaddressed. The following day, I realized I needed to confront my sister directly. It was clear that avoiding the problem was only exacerbating it, so I decided to call her and propose we meet for coffee. She readily agreed, her voice bright and seemingly oblivious to my growing anxieties. We arranged to meet at a quaint cafe near her apartment. When we met, I was visibly nervous, my hands trembling slightly as I stirred my coffee. My sister, conversely, was in high spirits, enthusiastically discussing her wedding arrangements. She seemed utterly unaware of my discomfort, which only intensified the difficulty of the situation for me. After several minutes of listening to her speak, I realized I couldn't hold back any longer. I interrupted her mid-sentence, my voice betraying the gravity of what I was about to say. I told her we needed to discuss something significant. My sister, caught off guard by the abrupt change in tone, looked at me with surprise and asked what was wrong. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I began to explain. I told her I had observed her behavior around Tom, my boyfriend, and that it was making me uncomfortable. I brought up the flirting, the casual touches, and the lingering gazes, aspects that had been troubling me for quite some time. I emphasized that her conduct needed to cease. As I spoke, I watched her face undergo a series of transformations. Initially, there was surprise, then confusion, and finally anger. She demanded to know what I was implying, vehemently denying that she had been flirting with Tom in any way. I refused to back down, insisting she had been doing precisely that, whether she recognized it or not. I explained that her actions were not only inappropriate, but were also causing me considerable distress. She responded with a laugh, though it was far from genuine. She told me I was being absurd, dismissing my concerns by claiming that Tom was practically family and that she was simply being friendly. However, her words did little to alleviate the tension between us, and I could tell this conversation had struck a raw nerve. As I sat there, it became clear that this wouldn't be an easy issue to resolve, and the division between us was likely to deepen. I couldn't restrain myself any further and articulated my frustrations, pointing out that it was far more than mere friendliness. I explained she was constantly devising excuses to be near my boyfriend, to touch him, and to laugh at all his jokes, even the ones I found rather unfunny. It was evident what she was doing, and it was making me increasingly uneasy. As I spoke, I could see her face flush with anger and disbelief. She was clearly stunned by my accusations, particularly as they came so close to her wedding day. She retaliated with a sharp retort, questioning my self-assurance and suggesting I must be profoundly insecure to accuse her of such behavior. Her words stung, but I knew I had to maintain my stance. I attempted to explain that my concerns weren't about insecurity, but rather about respect. I told her she was crossing an unacceptable boundary and that her behavior needed to stop immediately. Abruptly, she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, signaling the abrupt end of our exchange. She declared she would not sit there and endure what she considered paranoid and preposterous accusations. She made it clear that if I couldn't trust my own sister, then that was my burden, not hers. With that, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving me alone with a whirlwind of emotions. I felt awful and began to doubt myself. Had I overreacted? Was I truly just being paranoid? When I returned home, my boyfriend immediately perceived that something was amiss. He inquired what had transpired, and I recounted the conversation I had just had with my sister. As I shared the details, I could see the concern deepening on his face. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh and told me he thought I had made a significant error. He was worried that Sarah would be deeply wounded, especially with her wedding merely days away. Feeling defensive, I asked him if he was aligning with her. He quickly reassured me he wasn't choosing sides, but he expressed his doubts that Sarah had been flirting with him. Even if she had been, which he found improbable, he believed confronting her in such a direct manner was not the most effective approach to handling the situation. His words left me feeling even more conflicted, unsure whether I had acted correctly. As tears welled in my eyes, I couldn't help but ask, "So, what was I supposed to do?" Just overlook it. The frustration and hurt were palpable in my voice. Sensing my distress, my boyfriend walked over and gently wrapped his arms around me. He suggested that perhaps I could have managed things differently, that maybe I could have discussed it more with him first or approached Sarah in a less confrontational way. He voiced concern that now, with how events had unfolded, Sarah was likely upset with both of us, and this could cast a shadow over her forthcoming wedding, making everything incredibly awkward. Feeling overwhelmed, I pulled away from his embrace and challenged him, "So this is entirely my fault." I needed to understand if he genuinely believed I was to blame for the predicament. He sighed deeply, clearly struggling to articulate his thoughts, and explained he didn't intend to place the responsibility solely on me. However, he did believe I might have overreacted, allowing my emotions to get the better of me. We continued to argue for some time, but it became clear we would not reach a resolution. There was a distinct gap in our perspectives, and neither of us seemed willing to fully comprehend the other's viewpoint. Eventually, he decided to retire, leaving me alone with my turbulent thoughts and uncertainties. The days that followed were consumed by tension. My sister had completely ceased speaking to me, creating a painful chasm between us. My parents, having noticed Sarah's distress, telephoned me, wanting to understand why she was so upset. I tried to explain the circumstances to them, but I could discern from their reactions that they, too, believed I had overreacted. As the wedding day approached, I found myself increasingly hesitant about what course of action to take. I was slated to be a bridesmaid, a significant role that now felt more like a burden. I wasn't even certain if Sarah still wanted me to be part of her momentous occasion. My boyfriend, conversely, was still invited, and he proposed that we both attend to demonstrate that there were no lingering ill feelings. But the thought of standing there, observing my sister walk down the aisle while knowing how angry and wounded she felt, made me physically ill. The entire situation had spiraled into a convoluted mess, and I couldn't fathom how to unravel it without inflicting even more pain. Several times I attempted to call Sarah, but she never picked up. My voicemails, offering apologies and suggesting we ought to speak, went unanswered. I even visited her apartment, but she simply shut the door. My anxiety intensified as the wedding day drew nearer. Though I remained unconvinced, my partner repeatedly urged me to let go, asserting that everything would eventually blow over. I had a dream where I arrived at the wedding, and everyone turned to stare at me, pointing and murmuring. I awoke in a cold sweat. Update: following my direct confrontation with Sarah, matters worsened considerably when she recounted my allegations to our mother. My mother became quite incensed. She called me, screaming about how incredibly selfish I could be right before Sarah's wedding, and worried. She vehemently demanded, "How could you accuse your own sister of such a thing?" She refused to listen as I attempted to convey my viewpoint. She instructed me to rectify this problem immediately and offer an apology to Sarah. The strain on our family was becoming unbearable. Sarah still actively avoided conversing with me, and now my parents were also offended. Tom, my partner, persisted in telling me I was exaggerating, which only deepened my despondency and irritation. 1 week prior to the wedding, I visited my parents' home to try and sort things out. As I approached the front door, I heard muffled voices emanating from the side of the house. Intrigued, I strolled toward the garden and halted in astonishment at the sight before me. Sarah and Tom were partially obscured behind a large plant, locked in a fervent embrace. They were kissing deeply, Sarah's legs were wrapped around Tom's waist, and his hand was beneath her top. They were so utterly engrossed in one another that they failed to even notice me standing there. I felt as though I had been punched in the stomach. All the air left my lungs, and for a full minute, I was unable to move or speak. As the stark reality of what I was witnessing began to sink in, a potent wave of anger and profound betrayal surged through me. My emotions overwhelmed me, and I heard myself screaming, "What the hell is this?" My voice trembled, thick with the raw intensity of my feelings. The reaction from both of them was instantaneous. My sister and my boyfriend froze in shock, their guilty expressions betraying them completely. Sarah's face drained of color, turning utterly pale as she grasped she had been caught, while Tom fumbled for words, stammering, "It's not what it looks like." But it was precisely what it looked like, confirming every fear and suspicion that had been gnawing at me. Tears began streaming down my face as I choked out, "How could you?" My own sister and my boyfriend. The agony in my voice was unmistakable. Sarah, too, began to weep, her voice quivering with remorse as she attempted to apologize. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, struggling to articulate. "We didn't mean for this to happen." But I couldn't bear to hear any of their excuses. The betrayal was too profound, too raw. Without another word, I turned and fled, rushing back to my car. Their desperate pleas for me to return fell on deaf ears as I drove away, my mind reeling with disbelief and hurt. As I sped away, my phone began to ring ceaselessly. First Tom, then Sarah, and finally my mother. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. The pain was too fresh, too overwhelming. When I finally arrived home, I felt numb. I immediately packed a bag with some clothes and the essentials I would need for a few days. I couldn't remain there, not after what had just occurred. I sent Tom a final text message, simply stating, "We're done. Don't try to contact me again." Then I powered off my phone, severing any further communication, and departed. Now I am composing this from a hotel room in a neighboring city, uncertain of what my next course of action should be. With the wedding merely a few days away, I know there is no possibility I can attend. My relationship is utterly shattered, and the bond one once shared with my sister may be irreparably damaged by this profound betrayal. It feels as though my entire world has been inverted. Everyone made me feel as if I was delusional for suspecting something was amiss, but in the end, I was right all along. The anguish of that realization is almost too much to bear, and I find myself questioning how I will ever be able to trust anyone again after this. So, Reddit, any guidance on how to move forward from here would be deeply appreciated. Update. After the crushing revelation of discovering my sister Sarah with my now ex-boyfriend Tom, I spent several days in a daze, struggling to comprehend what had occurred. My phone buzzed constantly with messages and missed calls from both of them, as well as from my parents, but I simply couldn't bring myself to respond. I was too overwhelmed, too profoundly hurt. Eventually, though, I came to the realization that Mark, Sarah's fiancé, was one person who absolutely needed to be informed of the truth. With a heavy heart, I made the difficult decision to call him. When Mark answered, I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. He asked what was going on, mentioning that Sarah had been in a terrible state, claiming I had vanished and wasn't responding to anyone. Taking a deep breath, I began to explain everything to him. I told him about my initial suspicions, how everyone, including Tom and Sarah, had disregarded my concerns, and then I described in vivid detail the scene I had witnessed in my parents' garden. Mark listened quietly, not interrupting, only occasionally making a soft sound to indicate he was still present, absorbing every word I uttered. When I finally finished, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a controlled, measured voice, Mark simply thanked me for informing him, adding that he required some time to process this information. With that, he concluded the call. Afterwards, I sat there, staring blankly at my phone, wondering what Mark would do now that he possessed the truth. As the wedding day drew closer, I received no further communication from him or from the rest of my family. Sarah had ceased attempting to contact me, and I began to suspect that she had somehow managed to persuade Mark to forgive her. The notion that she might actually escape the repercussions of her actions, that she could proceed to have her fairy tale wedding while my life lay in ruins, made me feel physically unwell. I understood that there was no way I could attend the wedding. The thought of watching Sarah walk down the aisle, knowing what she had done, was too agonizing to bear. Instead, I resolved to spend that day alone, focusing on how to rebuild my life in the wake of such a profound betrayal. On the evening of the wedding, I received an unexpected call from my cousin Emma. There was an unmistakable tone of excitement and urgency in her hushed voice as she exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, you will not believe what just transpired." Confused and intrigued, I asked her what she meant. Without hesitation, Emma launched into her narrative, recounting the events that had unfolded. She explained that everything had appeared normal at first. Sarah had looked breathtaking in her wedding dress, and Mark had been standing at the altar, prepared for the ceremony to commence. But when it came time for the vows, Mark had unexpectedly stepped forward and announced that he had something to say. My heart began to pound as I listened to Emma describe the scene. Mark, before everyone, declared that he could not proceed with the wedding. He informed the guests that he could not marry someone who had betrayed her own sister and devastated her life by becoming involved with her boyfriend. Emma continued, recounting how Sarah had turned completely pale at Mark's words. Then, to everyone's shock, Mark turned to my parents and offered an apology, telling them they needed to know the genuine reason why I had distanced myself from the family. Emma went on to say that Sarah had begun crying. My parents had been left startled and bewildered, and the guests had started murmuring among themselves in an attempt to make sense of things. Mark had then walked out of the church, leaving Sarah sobbing alone at the altar. "It was like something out of a movie," Emma told me, her voice still tinged with disbelief. "Everyone's in shock. Your parents are trying to get the full account from Sarah, but she's an emotional wreck." As I sat there, absorbing everything Emma had just relayed to me, I felt a confluence of emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of vindication, knowing that the truth had finally come to light. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the pain and upheaval this had brought upon my family. Emma, sensing my silence, gently inquired, "Are you all right?" I'm not sure," I admitted truthfully. I never wanted it to end like this. After a little more conversation with Emma, I ended the call and sat silently, attempting to sort through things. At what cost? The truth was revealed. My bond with Sarah was fractured, my relationship with Tom had ended, and now my entire family was in turmoil. I came to realize that although the truth was now undeniable, it did not instantly rectify everything. Healing and regaining trust still lay a long road ahead. But I felt a small sense of relief for the first time since this entire ordeal began. At least now I could start to move forward, unburdened by the weight of unspoken facts dragging me down. Regarding what comes next, I'm still uncertain, though I know I will eventually have to face my family. For now, I am living one day at a time. If nothing else, this experience has shown me the immense value of trusting my intuition and standing up for myself, even when others question me. To all who offered support throughout my journey, thank you. Your words of encouragement hold more value than you could possibly know. And to others in similar circumstances, always remember to rely on your gut feeling and resist being gaslighted into disbelieving your own perceptions by anyone. Thank you for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more compelling real-life narratives unfolding around you.